The star originally in the sort of beginning episodes is a young female miner named Betsy, played by Caitlin Dever, who suffers an injury. She's the daughter of a miner as well. She lives with her parents. She's not a drug addict. She's not an alcoholic. She's a sweet, dreamy faced young miner. It's just such an interesting job for a young woman like that. Sympathetic character for sure. And I love that you chose her because this was representative of, I think, the opioid crisis for most people. These weren't back alley deals. These were people who were prescribed a drug by a doctor they trusted to treat an injury that was real. And then the spiral came.
Yeah, absolutely. And partly why I did this approach was because this is where Purdue Pharma, that was their phase 1 areas where they targeted, which were rural areas filled with people that had a higher prescription rate of opioids because they just got injured a lot on the job. So miners, loggers, farmers. Those were basically the 3 areas that Purdue Pharma initially targeted. And so it was, southwestern Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and rural Maine were kind of the ground zero spots. And I chose Appalachia and I chose mining. I thought it was very sort of emblematic of sort of our iconic view of how this all began. And I started watching YouTube videos of different people in these areas. And these YouTube videos, it's a technique I use for research because there's something so authentic about them. They're often amateur videos that are just taken by real people trying to put some kind of short subject documentary together about their lives. And I was so taken by so many of the miners and the pride they had in what they did, and that there was this sort of magical connection to the mountains. The Blue Ridge Mountains, the mountains in Appalachia. And, when I went on a research trip up there, I understood where that connection came from because they're really beautiful. It's just this very beautiful part of the country and very sort of isolated and on its own. So it seemed to me, this is a great way into the story. And I, in one of the videos, I saw this young woman who was a miner being interviewed. She struck me as someone who seemed like she was a lesbian. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Being a lesbian in a very, conservative part of the country where that may not be as accepted as, say, it is in New York City where I live. And I just wanted to explore these different issues. And so what happens when the issue begins, her arc begins about her sexuality and what that means to her and her family, but it quickly takes a left-hand turn when the drug use completely consumes it and takes it over. Mm-hmm. And that was so very much kind of the early stages of me putting this together. And I do want to throw a huge shout out to Beth Macy and her incredible book, Dopesick. Yeah. We ended up getting teamed up after I'd come up with these initial ideas. And I read the book and I loved it. And Beth has been an incredible part of the project and the process. She was in the writer's room and her and I kept doing interviews all the way throughout the entire process. So it's a big shout out to Dopesick author Beth Macy. And anyone listening to this, if you've seen the show and you haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, she's coming up next, so they're going to meet her momentarily. But she does get it. I mean, she sort of, her book is not totally dissimilar from Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. It just takes a hard, honest, and sometimes unfavorable view of Appalachia and what's happened there. And it's not critical of the people. It's just there's joblessness and there's disability claims and there's globalization and there are all sorts of things that have affected this part of the country that gets ignored too often. And then people are like, how did Trump get in office? And it's like, well, it's complicated, but it's understandable if you take the time. Okay, so
without a doubt.
You've got, Betsy is one of our main stars. And then you've got Dr. Samuel Phoenix, right? Just want to make sure I'm pronouncing it right because I know him as Sam. And that's played by Michael Keaton. And this character is trying to help his community. He loves West Virginia. He loves Appalachia. He loves the miners. He's trying to help. But like so many doctors in the opioid crisis, really didn't, right? He was pulled in by Purdue Pharma, as so many real life doctors were, and it's dazzling, snazzy drug reps who were saying all sorts of things about this drug, which is so exciting that they fooled even the doctors, which was a critical part of their plan.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's this perception of that all doctors that prescribed OxyContin were evil pill mill doctors that were, essentially legal drug dealers. And those people certainly did exist. And there were many pill mills and a number of people that have been arrested and gotten massive jail sentences, 30 years, 25 years. However, I believe that the majority of the doctors prescribing OxyContin were not that. They were completely well-intentioned doctors that believed what Purdue Pharma had told them. And even the sales reps at Purdue Pharma believed, at least initially, the information that they were given. There was basically this elaborate con in which Purdue Pharma, well, I'll start with these independent pain societies. These independent pain societies were creating this new movement that pain has been wildly undertreated in this country, and that opioids are much safer than we have perceived them for decades. And that this movement went so far as to term pain as the new fifth vital sign. So this was a huge campaign that was happening late 80s into the mid 90s, into the late 90s, right? During this whole period that coincided with Purdue Pharma coming up with a new opioid that they were marketing as non-addictive, which tied into the national movement of, yes, and opioids are much safer. And then these pain societies would put out studies. Certain doctors would write articles that would end up in these really respected medical news journals. And it gave this elaborate appearance that there's a whole new movement in medication and in pain treatment. And what we have learned is that these pain societies were not independent. They were partially or fully, in some cases, funded by Purdue Pharma. The doctors that were writing articles were funded by Purdue Pharma. And in some cases, the periodicals that these articles would come out in were funded by Purdue Pharma. So it was like an elaborate shell game, a con. And then when you go back in time to the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a man who basically created all of this entire elaborate shell game of having fake studies being written about by doctors on your payroll, put in periodicals that are also on your payroll that you would then use that to convince doctors of whatever you're trying to convince them. And this man was Arthur Sackler, the uncle of Richard Sackler, who was the godfather of OxyContin, right? So you see, oh no, this is what the family, they've been doing this for the last 50 years. This is just their playbook. And when you get into that this is a generational scam, I view it as sort of like pharma grifters. They're a family of pharma grifters, right? And then it goes back generations. It gets to be incredibly fascinating that there's this long history of it. And quite devious. This is covered in the book Dopesick, but there's another book called Empire of Pain that came out not too long ago that goes into Arthur Sackler in the 50s and the 60s in such exquisite detail. I call it Charles Dickens in hell. I mean, it's very Dickensian and quite fascinating, the entire family history of what they've done.
Obviously, the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma they do not come out favorably in the movie or the book or life. Although their lives are pretty good. Been written about it their lives are pretty damn good. But I'll tell you, the biggest villain right after them is the FDA. And you will not believe how Purdue Pharma managed to convince all these doctors that OxyContin was less addictive, that the doctors could feel totally comfortable prescribing it to young minors who may have hurt their backs and so on. Free form, just go for it. It's totally safe. How did they do it? With the help of a complicit FDA.